have 13 of them now. If you want to patrol the sea lanes in a more chaotic world, you don't want 12 platforms, half of which are going to be in port at any given time. You want hundreds of platforms like destroyers or arsenal ships. We don't have that anymore, or we don't have that yet anyway. So in a world where everyone in the American alliance defers to the United States on security issues and so does not float a hostile navy, and where your primary foes are Russia and China and they're functionally landlocked, this works. But when globalization goes away and each country has to start looking out for their own interests economically, and especially in the maritime realm, you will have multiple navies that are competing. And while the United States will, by and large, still have the most powerful navy by at least a factor of 5 moving forward, it's about a factor of 10 right now, we no longer can operate with complete impunity. And in that environment, we cannot protect the sea lanes for everyone. We can only protect the sea lanes for certain countries that, for whatever reason, have bought into our program, whatever that happens to be, administration by administration. We're not there yet, but we're getting there. Because in a world where the Russian energy supplies are disrupted, or in a world where the Chinese and the Japanese are at each other's throats, or in a world where Persian Gulf energy supplies break down, we will need regional powers will be forced to look after their own interests, and they cannot do that without a functional navy. There's no reason to expect the United States to enter into a significant war with any of them. In fact, a lot of them that will be arising are likely to be friendly rather than not. But the days when the United States can just by fiat dictate a security environment on the waves, those are gone. And we're in the transition now to whatever's next. While Ukraine suggests that maybe the United States is to a degree getting interested in the world again, we'll see how long it lasts. But for all the other conflicts that are going on in the world right now, I think they've just completely fallen off the radar. I mean, when was the last time you heard about Congo or Sudan or Yemen or even Iraq? You know, none of these conflicts have stopped. It's just the Americans have stopped caring. If you want to be involved, if the US government wants America to be involved, there is a case, you have to make the case to the American people about why it's worth intervention after 20 years of the forever wars. That's a hard call. And even with Ukraine, Biden has gone well out of his way to make it very clear that this is not going to be a regular conflict. There are risks, absolutely. Anything with the Russians is going to be risky. But we're not talking about forward surging forces to face the Russians down in eastern Ukraine, and that's not going to be on the agenda at all. So either you are a country that is able to negotiate a side deal with the United States, or you are on your own. And countries are still coming to terms with what that means. The country that by far is looking at the worst position are the Chinese, because the security situation in Ukraine has laid bare their 40 years of their planning as being wrong. And they're losing the ability to talk to the United States in a constructive way due to internal problems, and that the Americans are walking away too. And there's no country in the world that is more dependent upon the old system than the Chinese. To start out with, anyway, there's only going to be a very few. And they're countries that are either cultural cousins or just strategic necessities to keep options open. So Australia is far and away at the top of the list. Japan paid to join under Trump. And if you can cut a deal with both Biden and with Trump, you're good. And the Japanese have figured out how to make that work. Singapore, definitely a US ally moving forward. And of course, the United Kingdom. But anything outside of those four, you have to make the case. Now, we are seeing the first reinvigoration of NATO in decades. I would argue that Europe is operating on the same page for the first time since like the Treaty of Westphalia. This sort of integration and cooperation in Europe is utterly unprecedented. Let's hope it lasts. Beyond that, everything in the Western Hemisphere is kind of behind a bit of a cordon sanitaire. So it's not like a lot of the countries in the Western Hemisphere are allies, but the Mexicans are friends and family now, and that works. And the Americans have their own reasons for keeping Eastern Hemispheric powers out of the Western Hemisphere, which will benefit a lot of Western Hemispheric powers, but there's nothing that they can bring to the table in terms of security cooperation that will assist that. None of them have deployment capability. The closest, of course, would be Canada, and as we've discovered less than 6 weeks into the Ukraine war, they have already shipped everything that they have to the Ukrainians. The cupboard is bare. And so the Canadians are actually in Washington right now talking to arms manufacturers in the US about purchases because they don't have any of their our own anymore. They all broke down and closed after the Cold War. Sure. So let's start with the border. It's 2,000 miles long. It is completely impossible to defend with conventional means. People talk about putting the army down there, but assuming we put our entire military on the border, that's like one dude every couple of miles. We don't have the capacity to even monitor it, much less seal it. And all the talk of the war, the Sonoran and the Chihuahuan deserts are the greatest natural barriers in the Western Hemisphere. I'd argue they're actually even better than the Andes because the Andes have passes. If you build a road the entire length of it, you first have to build 50 construction roads to get to the border. And then you have obviated half of the border because you've made it easier for people to cross half the desert. So I would actually argue that the wall is responsible in large part for a lot of the extra legal migration we've seen in the last 5 years. Once you kind of digest that, you look at the picture a little bit differently, because it's much easier to smuggle drugs than it is to smuggle a person. It's a lightweight, high value topic, and by putting in roads, we've made it very, very easy for things to be driven all the way up into US metro regions. In that environment, you change the culture of Mexico. We used to shoot down planes or capture boats that were bringing in the stuff by water direct to the United States, in the Miami Vice days. And in doing so, that forced the cargo to go into southern Mexico, where it would start winding up through the mountain valleys until it eventually got to the US. Well, whenever you go up a mountain valley, you get concentrated groups, like organized crime groups, that grab a piece of it, and then they expand up and down that valley to take more and more and more of it until they clash. That's the drug war in Mexico, is the clashing over those transport routes. You fast forward to today, and there are two giant alliances of the drug cartels. One is the Sinaloa. They're kind of like the conglomerate version. They think of the drug smuggling business as a business, and they have expanded into parallel industries, into tourism and agriculture and property. And I don't mean to suggest that these are nice guys. They're drug runners. They are not nice guys, but they see violence as a means to an end rather than an end in and of itself. Well, you guys remember El Chapo. He was the leader of Sinaloa, and when we finally got El Chapo, a faction of Sinaloa broke away and eventually merged as what we now know as the Jalisco New Generation Cartel. And they see violence as an end in and of itself. They're far more brutal. They're far more likely to go to war with everyone. And that's one of the reasons why Eastern Mexico is such a violent place now, is because they've been going head to head with the cartels there and just wiping them out. And they're challenging Sinaloa as well. The problem moving forward is that Jalisco New Generation is now challenging the pre-existing cartels at every single border crossing. And as soon as they get one, they can start bringing in drugs in mass. So yes, this, in my opinion, is the greatest security threat that the United States faces over the long term, because it's not like we're going to end our relationship with Mexico. It's our largest energy relationship. It's our largest agricultural relationship. It's our